Hi everyone, I'm Anne. I'm one of the economics teachers at Walking College. What I'm going to do with you now is just share with you a very short lesson, just to give you an idea what economics is all about and to give you some idea what it might be like to study economics here at Walking College. What I'm going to do in a moment is share my screen with you. So what I'd like you to do is get a pen and some paper. And while we're sharing the screen, there'll be a few short activities come up on the screen. I'd like you to write down some ideas and then I'll come back to you a little bit later and we can check your answers against the ones that I've got. So I'm just going to share my screen. And here we go. Okay, so first thing I'd like you to do is have a look at these few short questions, and I'd like you to tell me whether or not you think these are true or false. So what you might want to do is just pause the video at this point just for a couple of minutes, write down your answers, and I'll come back to you in just a very short time. So teenagers drink more than equivalent of 234 cans of soft drink a year, which is equivalent to a bathtub full. That is actually true. That sounds quite a lot, but if you think about it, 234 cans a year is equivalent to just under one a day. It's just the fact a whole bathful seems quite a lot. A mocha drink, for those of you that don't drink coffee, that's a combination of coffee and hot chocolate, has about 15 teaspoons of sugar within it. And that is obviously, the worrying fact with that is the amount of calories that would then contain. Heinz tomato ketchup does have more sugar per 100 grams than a can of Coke. I think a lot of people think because things like ketchup are savoury, they're not going to have any sugar in them, but clearly there's sugar in all kinds of things, including things like bread. Excess sugar consumption has been proven to contribute directly to weight gain. That is true. That's one of the big problems with eating too much sugar. And then, should sugar be treated as a form of drug abuse? And that's an interesting one. One of the things that sugar has in common with a lot of drugs that are illegal is that actually sugar is also addictive and also has an impact on your health in the same way that things like illegal drugs like cannabis, for instance, does. Okay, so well done if you got all of those correct. You might be thinking, actually, what on earth has this all got to do with economics? So let's try and link the two things together at this point. So a few key terms for you. Number one, demerit good. Demerit good is a good which, when we consume it, it has a negative spillover effect on a third party. So if we think about something like cigarettes, if you consume a cigarette, it has an impact on you personally, but passive smoking has a big impact on other people, and other people can become quite unwell by inhaling other people's smoke. So that's a good example of a demerit good. The spillover effect there is the impact that cigarette smoke has on somebody else. Secondly, bounded rationality. Consumers' ability to make good decisions is often severely restricted due to incomplete or inaccurate information. So again, if we consider, for example, something like a gym membership, if you're a member of a gym, it makes good sense to go to the gym frequently, because that way you get your value for money on your gym membership. We all know that. Lots of people join the gym at Christmas, and lots of people by February time are not really using their membership, even though it makes good sense to actually get good value from that membership. And then thirdly, a nudge. Now, a nudge is a government action to try and change people's behaviour, but the idea is it doesn't stop us making the wrong choices or making bad decisions. It's just an attempt to help us to make better choices and better decisions by giving us a bit of a nudge or giving us a bit of a gentle shove into a certain behaviour in a certain way. Maybe just think for a minute about how those things might link to the consumption of sugar. So how could we link those three key terms to consumption of sugar? I'm going to ask you in a minute to think back to that when we move on to our next few activities. You'll hopefully see how those key terms actually link to what we're going to do from here on in. So what are the costs or the problems or the issues surrounded by consuming too much sugar? In economics, we tend to put this into two categories. We tend to talk about private cost, so cost to us personally as individuals. And then we tend to think about the cost to other people, and we tend to refer to that as the external cost or the cost to a third party. So when we think about consuming sugar, what are the costs to us personally? Well, I'll give you an example to start you off. By consuming too much sugar, we might end up with bad dental hygiene and therefore bad teeth. What's the impact on other people? Well, how does us consuming too much sugar affect other people? Well, perhaps one of the key impacts there is if we all eat too much sugar, we all end up with bad teeth, we all end up having to visit the dentist rather frequently, and that leads to a big problem for dentists because they obviously are going to have a huge demand for their services, and they could get overwhelmed by the sheer demand caused by tooth decay. So private cost, the cost to us individually, and in this case the impact on our health is a really important one. External cost, the cost to other people. Okay, so pause this video for a couple of minutes and I want you to try and come up with at least 3 or 4 more things in each of those 2 boxes, the cost to the individual and then the cost to the external other people. Okay, so what did you get? Did you get any of these? So these are some of the ones that I thought of. They're not necessarily every one that you could think of, but hopefully some of the things on my list are also on your list. So private cost, weight gain, low energy, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all impacts on us personally from consuming too much sugar. What people also don't realise quite often is sugar is quite addictive, and if we eat loads of sugar and then we try and stop sugar, we can actually end up with things like headaches and an even bigger impact on things like our energy levels. External costs then, we've talked about dentists already. More time generally, NHS time in treating things like obesity or problems related with people being overweight. And then money perhaps needing to go into spending on education, healthcare reminders to try and encourage people to actually live a bit more healthily. So private cost, cost to us, external cost, cost to the third party. So I asked you to think about that in regards to our 3 definitions. When we look at something like a negative externality, then clearly sugar is a really good example of a negative externality because it has external costs to the third party. So a big issue here is that when we make decisions about products, we don't think often about the long term. We tend to think very short term. And then we rarely think about the impact on other people. We tend to think more just about the impact on ourselves. So in economics, one of the things we have to think about is how we can encourage people to perhaps make better decisions for the benefit of everybody, not just for the benefit of themselves. So bringing this right back to kind of how that works in kind of a national level, government is in place to try and help and support consumers, try and make us make better decisions, try and make sure that people are taking care of themselves, but also thinking about the impact that too much sugar and bad diets in general might have on the NHS. So what could the government do? What kind of things might the government try to get us to be more healthy, to get us to eat better, and just generally to reduce the overall amount of sugar that people have in their diets? Again, what I'd like to do is pause the video, jot down a few ideas. I've got 6 bubbles there. See if you can fill all 6. That would be great. And just think about all the different ways the government might be able to actually stop us consuming too much sugar. Pause the video and have a go. So did you get any of these? You might have even come up with others. These are the half dozen that sprang to mind when I did this earlier. So we've got, we could change the law. So the government could actually put a law in place that says we can only have X amount of sugar per 100 grams in any bit of food that we eat. The government could introduce a tax on sugar, did that back in April 2018. So products that contain too much sugar actually cost us a little bit more now. You might have noticed that if you buy a bottle of Coke, that Coke has actually gone up in price, and that's to take into account the the cost of the sugar tax. Government could advertise on TV, could advertise in leaflets, could put things through outdoors. It could provide education. A lot of that, remember, comes through schools. So you probably have, perhaps through your PSHE curriculum, you probably have guidance there about healthy food and healthy lifestyles. The government can do a lot of work through the education system. It can use what we call nudges, mentioned that in our key terms earlier in the lesson. They can perhaps sponsor the provision of a mobile phone app. And there is actually mobile phone apps. There are apps you can buy just to kind of monitor your sugar intake, your calorie intake, just things to kind of help with your diet and exercise in general. And then the final one I've got there is they could subsidise healthier alternatives. Now, this normally comes up as a really popular choice if we did that. This is a normal kind of class-based lesson. Students would immediately think, well, the government can subsidise fruit and vegetables. It can subsidise fruit as an alternative to cakes and biscuits. Yeah, great idea, but it's not necessarily one of the government's most popular decisions. It tends to focus more on the top 2 or 3 and less on the kind of subsidising of healthier food. So this is one example of what the government could do. So this is an advert that was on the TV a couple of years ago, and it looks at the sugar, and it's used in a way to try and prevent us from consuming too much sugar. I'm just going to play the video and let you watch this for a couple of minutes.
We love sugary things, but too much sugar can lead to serious diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Now Mum's got an easy way to cut back on sugar, with lower sugar swaps on the things we eat every day. So we get less sugar and we're still happy.
Just 1 or 2 swaps can really make a difference. So make a swap when you next shop.
You might remember that video. You might have remembered seeing that before. The whole idea, obviously, is to encourage us to eat less sugar. Sorry, technical issue. But what I want to think about, that's one option. So that's an option the government tried a couple of years ago. You could argue that's an example of a nudge. So using advertising in a quite persuasive way to kind of make us stop and think a little bit. You might want to think about the imagery. You might want to think about the fact they're using kind of like plasticine people and things there, the colours, the language, the kind of imagery that's used within that video. But that's one example. They're trying to persuade us to behave slightly differently without kind of stopping us altogether from making our own decisions about sugar. But how effective do you think that is? So can you just have a think about that video you've just watched and the advertising that went with it? And can you list some of the pros and some of the cons? So how do you think that video is good and useful? It might encourage people to eat less sugar. And what do you think are some of the problems, the disadvantages of using that as a policy? Okay, so pause the video, jot down a few ideas, see if you can get 2 or 3 pros and 2 or 3 cons. So what do you get? So I've got 4 of each. So on the pros, probably would argue it's quite eye-catching, and the video itself is something that people probably remember. You probably remember the Smart Moves videos and things that went with this. Probably makes people stop and think, even if it's only for 5 minutes. The advert, I think, is really good at appealing to children. So it's what we call pester power, pestering parents to buy certain things. You can do that positively by encouraging people away from sugar into more popular, healthier things. And it's quite simple, isn't it? It's quite simple to make a video like that, roll it out every night at tea time, and it has quite a big impact. What about in the negatives? Well, you could argue that once you've watched the video, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go off and buy healthier food. It wouldn't be enough on its own. The government probably have to try other things as well. Even though we all know we shouldn't eat as much sugar, maybe if we can't afford to, maybe we would have to buy cheap processed food because they haven't got the income to buy more expensive, healthier food. And there's no guarantee that once you stop showing these videos, are people going to carry on consuming sugar? Or are they going to change back to what they were doing beforehand? So there's no kind of long-term benefit from using something like that. So the conclusion to that might be that every time we look at economic problems, there isn't just one solution, there are many solutions. And each solution will have its pros and cons. So each solution might work in certain circumstances, but doesn't work all the time for everyone. And the government constantly has to rethink the policies that it's using. And again, well done if you came up with other things that weren't on that list. That isn't a conclusive list by any means. You've probably got other things that are not on there. But they're the 4 things that immediately sprang to mind when I was looking at this. So what have we learned today then? We've learned hopefully 3 new key terms, one of which was that sugar might be considered a demerit good. So what do we think? So sugar is a demerit good. Why might that be? A, B, C or D? Write it down. So hopefully you got the second one. Sugar is considered a demerit good because in consuming it, we impact on third parties. So by eating too much sugar, by becoming unhealthy, perhaps overweight, developing heart disease, diabetes, those kinds of things, that puts a strain on the NHS, and therefore our actions have an implication for other people. So that's the third party. Again, true or false? Which of these is true? To reduce the consumption of sugar, the government must do what? So hopefully, looking at those 4 options, looking at what we've talked about this today, there are always going to be a variety of different ways to approach these problems. There's not one policy that works for every single problem out there. And what the government has to do is try a variety of different things. And then finally, which of these is false? Yeah, the top one. So there isn't a right answer in economics. Yes, you should have an opinion on things. It's useful to be interested in current affairs, but there's never a right answer, or there isn't always a right answer. Okay, so I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight into what economics is about. If you have any questions about either economics or studying economics with us at Woking College, you can contact Steve Green, who is our head of economics, or you can contact myself using those 2 email addresses that I've given you there. Thank you very much, and hopefully I will see some of you in the autumn open evening in October. Thank you and goodbye.